In 1971, a private auction house in New York quietly moved what might be the most controversial journal ever written by an American military officer, Admiral Richard Byrd's personal diary from his Antarctic expeditions. The winning bid was never disclosed. The buyer's name was sealed, and the journal itself disappeared from public record for over 3 decades. But here's what makes this different from every other classified document you've heard about. Admiral Byrd wasn't just any explorer. He led the largest Antarctic expedition in history, Operation High Jump, with 4,700 men, 13 ships, and 33 aircraft. The official mission was mapping and establishing research bases. The mission lasted 6 months, but they pulled out after 8 weeks. No explanation given. Byrd's journal from that expedition was supposed to be archived with the rest of his military records. Instead, it ended up at auction, and someone paid a fortune to make sure you never saw it. If you're finding this valuable, hit subscribe. I cover suppressed history and alternative narratives every week. Now, let's talk about what was actually in that journal. Richard Evelyn Byrd was born in 1888 into Virginia aristocracy. His brother Harry became a U.S. senator. His family had connections to power that ran deep. He joined the Navy in 1912, became a pilot, and by 1926 was leading polar expeditions. The man was a national hero. He claimed to be the first to fly over the North Pole, though that claim has since been disputed by his own flight logs. But the North Pole missions were just the warm-up. In 1928, Byrd established Little America, the first major American base in Antarctica. He spent the winter of 1934 alone at an advanced weather station, nearly dying from carbon monoxide poisoning. His survival story became a bestseller. By the time World War II ended, Byrd wasn't just an explorer. He was a strategic military asset with unmatched polar experience. That's why the Navy picked him to lead Operation High Jump in 1946. The official story is straightforward. Operation High Jump was a military exercise to test equipment in extreme cold, train personnel for Arctic conditions, and establish American presence in Antarctica before the Soviets could. 13 ships, 4,700 men, and 33 aircraft deployed in December 1946. They were supposed to stay until April 1947, but in late February, after only 8 weeks, the operation was abruptly terminated. Ships recalled, planes grounded, men sent home. The official explanation was weather and equipment failures, but the operation was planned for Antarctic summer, when weather is most favorable, and the equipment was specifically designed for polar conditions. When Byrd returned to the United States in March 1947, he gave a press interview to a Chilean newspaper, El Mercurio. The reporter asked about military lessons from the expedition. Byrd's response became one of the most analyzed quotes in alternative history circles. He said the United States needed to prepare for the possibility of an invasion by hostile aircraft coming from the polar regions, and that, in case of a new war, America could be attacked by fighters that are able to fly from one pole to the other with incredible speed. Not Soviet planes, not conventional aircraft. Fighters with incredible speed operating from polar regions. 3 weeks after that interview, Byrd was ordered to Washington for debriefing. The debriefing lasted several hours. No transcript was ever released. Byrd was placed under a de facto gag order. He never spoke publicly about Operation High Jump again in detail, but he kept writing in his personal journal. That journal contained daily entries, observations, and details about what his expedition actually encountered in Antarctica. And in 1971, 4 years after Byrd's death, that journal went to auction. The auction was handled by a private firm, not a major house like Sotheby's or Christie's. No public catalogue listing, no media coverage, just a quiet sale to a private buyer whose identity was never disclosed. The journal vanished into a private collection. For 30 years, no researcher, historian, or family member confirmed seeing it. Then, in the early 2000s, excerpts started appearing online, typed transcriptions claiming to be from Byrd's 1947 journal. The entries described events that, if true, would rewrite everything we know about Antarctica, military history, and what lies beneath the ice. The excerpts describe Byrd's flight on the 19th of February 1947. According to the typed pages, Byrd took off from Little America Base on a routine mapping mission. The plan was to fly inland, photograph unmapped terrain, and return. But somewhere over the interior plateau, his instruments began malfunctioning, compasses spinning, altitude readings fluctuating. The ice below changed color, turning from white to greenish and yellowish hues. Then he saw something that shouldn't exist. Mountains, but not ice-covered peaks. Mountains with forests. valleys with rivers, green vegetation in a region where temperatures should make plant life impossible. The journal describes Byrd ordering his crew to descend for a closer look. As they dropped altitude, the temperature outside the aircraft rose. The landscape below looked like a temperate zone. Rolling hills, forests, what appeared to be animals grazing. And then, according to the journal, they were intercepted. Disc-shaped aircraft appeared on both sides of Byrd's plane. No wings, no visible propulsion, moving with speed and maneuverability that made conventional flight look primitive. The discs escorted Byrd's plane, guiding it toward a landing area. The journal describes a landing on smooth terrain. A welcoming committee of tall, blonde individuals in strange clothing. Communication in English, though the beings claimed to be from an advanced civilization living inside the Earth. Byrd was taken to meet someone referred to as the Master. The Master explained that his people had been observing surface humanity with growing concern, particularly after the atomic bombings in Japan. The Master warned that humanity was on a destructive path, that nuclear weapons threatened not just the surface but the inner realms as well. Byrd was chosen as a messenger. His mission was to return to the surface and deliver this warning to world leaders. The beings escorted him back to his plane, and he flew back to Little America Base. If this journal is authentic, it would explain the abrupt termination of Operation High Jump. It would explain Byrd's cryptic warnings about polar threats. It would explain the gag order and the secret debriefing in Washington. But there's a problem. The excerpts that circulated online cannot be verified. No one has produced the original journal. The auction records from 1971 are sealed. The buyer remains anonymous. And Byrd's official military logs from February 1947 show routine mapping flights with no anomalies reported. Skeptics point out that the online excerpts read like 1960s science fiction. The language doesn't match Byrd's writing style from his published books. The descriptions of the inner Earth civilization mirror popular hollow Earth theories that were circulating in occult circles during the 1940s and 50s. The whole thing could be an elaborate hoax created decades after Byrd's death. But the fact remains that a journal was auctioned in 1971 and someone paid to keep it private. Why? One theory focuses on what Byrd actually encountered, stripped of the fantastic elements. During Operation High Jump, the expedition did discover warm zones in Antarctica, ice-free regions with unusual geological features. The Bunga Oasis, for example, is an ice-free area discovered in 1947 with lakes that remain liquid year-round. Volcanic activity creates pockets of warmth. Geothermal vents melt ice from below. These are documented phenomena. Perhaps Byrd's journal described these discoveries in detail, but the military classified the information for strategic reasons. Antarctica was about to become a geopolitical chess piece. The Antarctic Treaty wouldn't be signed until 1959. Any nation that discovered resource-rich, ice-free zones would have a massive advantage. If Byrd's journal contained detailed maps and geological data, that would be worth suppressing. Another theory ties Operation High Jump to something darker. In 1945, Nazi Germany collapsed. But not all Nazi personnel were accounted for. Submarines went missing. High-ranking officers disappeared. Rumors spread that some had escaped to secret bases in South America or Antarctica. The Nazis had conducted their own Antarctic expeditions in the 1930s, claiming a territory they called New Swabia. They built a base. Some researchers believe that base continued operating after the war ended. The German Antarctic expedition of 1938–39, led by Alfred Richer, mapped over 600,000 square kilometers of territory. They dropped markers with swastikas claiming the land for Germany. Official records say it was about whaling rights and establishing a future base for resource extraction. But the expedition also included geologists, geophysicists, and engineers. They weren't just mapping coastline. They were assessing the interior. German submarine activity in the South Atlantic increased dramatically in the final years of the war. U-boats were spotted near the Argentine coast in 1945, months after Germany's surrender. 2 submarines, U-530 and U-977, surrendered in Argentina in July and August 1945, long after the war ended in Europe. Their captains claimed they had been at sea when Germany fell and sailed to Argentina to surrender rather than return to occupied Germany. But the boats were searched, and both had modified cargo compartments. Room for passengers or cargo beyond standard supplies. If Operation High Jump was actually a military strike against a Nazi holdout in Antarctica, Byrd's journal would contain details the US government would never want public. Combat operations on neutral territory. Engagements with enemy forces years after Germany's surrender. Technology captured or encountered that didn't fit conventional understanding. The expedition included a naval aviation group with fighter aircraft, not typical for a scientific survey mission. They had firepower. They had Marines. The official explanation was that these were simply security measures and training exercises. But why would you need that level of military presence for mapping missions unless you expected resistance? But there's a third interpretation that connects to something bigger than Byrd's expedition: the Tartaria theory. For those unfamiliar, Tartaria refers to a proposed advanced civilization that existed across much of Asia and parts of Europe, supposedly erased from mainstream history through deliberate suppression. Proponents point to architectural anomalies, maps showing Tartary as a recognized nation, and rapid industrialization in the 1800s that doesn't match official technological timelines. If such a civilization existed and was deliberately erased, Antarctica might be connected, not as the homeland of Tartaria, but as a refuge. A place where remnants of advanced pre-industrial knowledge survived. Consider the evidence for rapid technological advancement that doesn't fit official narratives. The World's Fair expositions of the late 1800s showcased massive classical architecture, entire cities built in months, then demolished after the fairs ended. Official history says these were temporary structures made of plaster and wood, but photographs show stone construction, ornate detail work that would take years to complete. The 1,893 Chicago World's Fair covered 600 acres with over 200 buildings. Built in 2 years, demolished within months. Workers with 1890s technology supposedly constructed neoclassical palaces, then tore them down. Why? The official answer is that they were always meant to be temporary. But that doesn't explain the level of craftsmanship or the speed of construction. Tartaria theory suggests these weren't new buildings. They were existing structures from a previous civilization, repurposed for the fairs, then destroyed to eliminate evidence. If that's true, and if Tartaria was a global civilization with advanced engineering and architectural knowledge, then Antarctica becomes relevant. What if the same civilization that built the grand structures across Asia and Europe also established outposts in Antarctica during a period when the climate was different? What if those outposts preserved knowledge that was lost everywhere else? And what if polar explorers in the 1800s and early 1900s weren't discovering new territory but rediscovering old settlements? Think about the timeline. The 1800s saw a rush of Antarctic exploration. Not casual exploration, but heavily funded expeditions by multiple world powers. Britain, Russia, France, the United States, all racing to map a frozen wasteland with no obvious economic value. Official history says it was scientific curiosity and national pride. But what if they were searching for something? Maps from the 1500s show Antarctica's coastline in detail, supposedly impossible since the continent wasn't officially discovered until the 1800s. The Piri-Reis map, created in 1513, shows features of the Antarctic coast that wouldn't be mapped again until the 1900s, using ground-penetrating radar. How did 16th century cartographers have that information? One explanation is that earlier civilizations had mapped Antarctica when it wasn't frozen. Geological evidence suggests parts of Antarctica were ice-free as recently as 6,000 years ago, though mainstream science disputes the exact timeline. If an advanced civilization existed during that period, they would have mapped the continent before ice covered it. Those maps could have survived through trade routes, ending up in the hands of later mapmakers who copied them without understanding their true origin. By the 1800s, powerful interests would have realized these maps were showing something real. Hence the rush to Antarctica. Not to discover, but to recover. If Byrd's journal described finding evidence of pre-ice habitation in Antarctica, architectural remains, artifacts, or technology that predated accepted history, the implications would shatter academic consensus. It would prove that advanced human civilization existed far earlier than admitted. It would validate alternative historical models that academia has spent centuries dismissing. And it would raise questions about what else has been hidden. The buyer who purchased that journal in 1971 wasn't just collecting a historical curiosity, they were acquiring proof that the official narrative is incomplete at best, deliberately falsified at worst. Consider who had the resources and motivation to buy that journal. Government agencies could have simply classified it through legal channels. They wouldn't need to buy it at auction. That suggests a private buyer, wealthy collector, think tank, organization with interests, in maintaining specific narratives about history and human development. The kind of buyer who understands that controlling information is more effective than destroying it. Keep the journal intact but inaccessible. That way, if the information ever needs to be released or leveraged, it still exists. There's a pattern here that goes beyond Byrd. polar exploration in general has a strange history of secrecy and abrupt terminations. The 1829 Russian expedition, led by Fabian von Bellingshausen, circumnavigated Antarctica but reported finding nothing of interest, despite spending months mapping the coast. The 1840 American expedition under Charles Wilkes returned with extensive surveys, but many of his findings were suppressed or disputed by the Navy. The 1911 race to the South Pole between Amundsen and Scott became legendary, but both expeditions reported strange magnetic anomalies and compass failures that official reports minimized. Then there's the Antarctic Treaty of 1959. 43 nations signed an agreement making Antarctica a scientific preserve, banning military activity and prohibiting mineral exploitation. On the surface, it's international cooperation for environmental protection, but dig deeper and you find unusual provisions. Article 9 allows inspection of any facility at any time, supposedly to ensure compliance. But it also means any signatory nation can investigate what others are doing. That level of transparency is rare in international agreements. It suggests the treaty wasn't just about protecting penguins. It was about making sure no one found something significant and kept it secret. The timing of the treaty is interesting too. 1959 was 12 years after Operation High Jump, enough time for multiple nations to conduct their own expeditions and assessments. The Soviet Union established Vostok Station in 1957, drilling deep into the ice. Britain maintained continuous presence at Halley Station starting in 1956. Argentina, Chile, Australia, and France all launched expeditions in the 1950s, all claiming territories, all building bases. If several countries independently discovered something unusual, the treaty makes sense as a framework to manage the discovery while keeping it quiet. No single nation could claim it. No one could exploit it without others knowing. A frozen détente, literally and figuratively. But there's more. The treaty contains provisions that essentially freeze all territorial claims without resolving them. 7 nations claimed overlapping sectors of Antarctica before 1959. The treaty didn't invalidate those claims, it suspended them. Countries can maintain their claims but can't act on them. That's a diplomatic oddity. Why not resolve the territorial disputes outright? Unless the real purpose was to prevent any nation from establishing exclusive access to whatever exists beneath the ice. Keep everyone watching everyone else. No monopolies on discovery. Byrd's legacy adds another layer. After Operation High Jump, he led one more Antarctic expedition, Operation Deep Freeze, in 1955 to 56. This time, he stayed within official parameters. Established permanent research stations. Focused on scientific data collection. No controversial incidents. No cryptic warnings about polar threats. It's as if the first expedition taught him what happened when you strayed from the script. The second expedition was textbook protocol. But even during Deep Freeze, Byrd kept a journal. That journal has never been auctioned. It remains in official Navy archives. The difference? Deep Freeze didn't encounter anything that needed to be hidden. The 1971 auction represents a specific moment in time. Byrd had been dead for 4 years. His family likely needed to manage his estate. Personal papers, journals, correspondence, all needed to be catalogued and distributed. Most went to official archives or family members, but the 1947 journal was different. Someone recognized its value, not as a historical document, but as leverage. Put it up for private auction. Let interested parties bid. The highest bidder gets to control the narrative. And they did. For 3 decades, that journal stayed hidden. The typed excerpts that appeared online in the 2000s, whether authentic or fabricated, created just enough mystery to keep people searching without revealing hard proof. This connects to a broader pattern in suppressed history. Artifacts that challenge mainstream narratives don't disappear entirely. They get moved into private collections. That way, academics can dismiss them as unverified, while private interests maintain access. The Baghdad Battery. The Antikythera mechanism before it was studied. Ancient maps showing impossible geographical knowledge. They surface briefly, create controversy, then vanish into vaults where they can't be properly examined but can't be completely forgotten either. What's in Byrd's journal? Probably not literal inner Earth civilizations with blonde masters issuing warnings. That reads too much like Cold War paranoia mixed with occult fantasy. But something happened during Operation High Jump that the Navy didn't want public. Could be they found Nazi holdouts and engaged them in combat, creating a diplomatic nightmare. Could be they discovered resources or geological features with strategic value that they wanted to keep secret from other nations. Could be Byrd encountered technology or artifacts that didn't fit conventional timelines, raising questions about prior civilizations in Antarctica. The journal buyer might have been connected to academic institutions, trying to control the release of destabilizing information. Could have been private collectors interested in alternative history. Could have been intelligence services acquiring the journal through a cutout to prevent foreign powers from getting it. The amount paid remains unknown, but private auctions of military documents in that era typically ran into six figures when the content was considered sensitive. For comparison, classified World War II intelligence documents were selling for $20,000 to $50,000 in the early 1970s. A journal from a controversial Antarctic expedition by a nationally known admiral would have commanded premium pricing, especially if potential buyers understood what it contained. We'll likely never know, unless that journal surfaces again. But the fact that it was auctioned rather than archived tells us it contained something outside normal historical record keeping. Standard protocol for deceased military officers is that personal papers get reviewed by the Department of Defense, classified materials get pulled, and the remainder goes to official archives or family members. The Navy has an entire historical center dedicated to preserving records from notable officers. Byrd's Arctic flight logs are there. His published expedition journals are there. His correspondence with presidents and military officials is catalogued and available to researchers. But the 1947 journal from Operation High Jump took a different path entirely. Someone made the decision to bypass official channels. That decision required authorization. The Byrd family would have needed to agree. The auction house would have needed to verify provenance without alerting government archivists. And the buyer would have needed to ensure the transaction stayed private. That level of coordination suggests multiple parties with aligned interests, all wanting the journal controlled, none wanting fingerprints on the transaction. Antarctica itself remains one of the least explored places on Earth. We've mapped more of Mars than we have of the Antarctic seafloor. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed massive lakes beneath miles of ice, liquid water in regions where surface temperatures are deadly. Lake Vostok, buried under 2 miles of ice, contains an estimated 1,300 cubic miles of liquid water. It's been sealed off from the surface for potentially millions of years. Russian scientists drilled down to it in 2012, extracting samples that showed microbial life. But the drilling was controversial. Some scientists warned that contamination from the surface could destroy whatever unique ecosystem existed in isolation. Others suggested the real concern wasn't about contamination, but about what might be found in the lake itself. Satellite imagery shows anomalies, geometric shapes visible beneath the ice that could be natural formations or could be something else. The Wilkesland crater, discovered in 2006, suggests a massive impact event that might have triggered geological changes across the continent. The crater is roughly 300 miles across, buried under ice in East Antarctica. If confirmed, it would be one of the largest impact structures on Earth, potentially caused by an asteroid strike that occurred around 250 million years ago during the Permian-Triassic extinction event. But here's what's interesting. The crater shows signs of secondary structures within it, formations that don't match typical impact morphology. Some researchers have suggested these could be volcanic features created by the impact. Others point to geometric patterns that seem too regular to be purely geological. If that impact occurred during a period of human habitation, it would have been catastrophic. Survivors would have fled, knowledge would have been lost, and the ice would have buried the evidence. But not just the evidence of the impact itself. Evidence of whatever existed before the impact. Settlements, structures, technology, all frozen in time beneath miles of ice, preserved better than any archaeological site on the surface. If Byrd's journal documented finding any of this, even indirect evidence like worked stone or metal fragments in ice cores, it would completely rewrite human history. This is where Byrd's journal becomes crucial. If he documented finding structures, artifacts, or evidence of habitation beneath the ice or in ice-free zones, it would prove that Antarctica wasn't always the frozen wasteland we know today. It would validate geological theories about rapid climate shifts. It would support alternative historical models suggesting advanced civilizations existed and collapsed before recorded history. And it would explain why powerful interests wanted that journal kept private. Not because it's false, but because it's true. The El Mercurio interview, the one where Byrd warned about polar threats, wasn't just paranoia. He was trying to communicate something within the bounds of what he was allowed to say. Hostile aircraft from polar regions with incredible speed. That's not describing Soviet bombers. That's describing something he encountered that operated beyond conventional aerospace understanding. Whether that was recovered Nazi technology, something found buried in the ice, or actual aerial phenomena he witnessed, Byrd was warning that Antarctica held threats the public wasn't being told about. His journal from 1947 would have contained specifics, flight paths, coordinates, descriptions of what he saw, names of crew members who witnessed it with him. That's why it had to be controlled. You can dismiss a verbal interview as misquotation or exaggeration. You can't dismiss a written journal with dates, times, and verifiable details. Whoever bought that journal in 1971 understood that. They weren't buying memorabilia. They were buying silence. We're left with fragments. Typed excerpts that may or may not be authentic. Official reports that sanitize whatever actually happened. A pattern of polar exploration marked by secrecy and abrupt mission changes. An international treaty that locks down an entire continent under the guise of environmental protection, and a journal, sold once, never seen again. The pieces form a picture, but the picture isn't complete. That's intentional. Complete information allows for definitive conclusions. Fragments allow for plausible deniability. You can't prove what happened if the evidence is locked in a private vault. Admiral Byrd spent his final years largely out of the public eye. He died in 1957, less than a year after returning from Operation Deep Freeze. His official biography mentions his achievements, his polar expeditions, his contributions to aviation and exploration. It doesn't mention the 1947 interview. It doesn't mention the early termination of Operation High Jump. It doesn't mention that his personal journal ended up at auction instead of in national archives. The man who was once a national hero became a footnote, remembered for flying over poles, but not for what he might have discovered beneath the ice. The buyer who acquired that journal in 1971 is likely dead now. Private collections eventually get dispersed through estates. The journal could surface again. It could already be in the hands of new owners who don't understand its significance. Or it could be exactly where it's supposed to be, held by an organization that understands its value and has no intention of ever releasing it. Either way, the silence around its contents tells us more than any official statement ever could. If the journal contained mundane observations about ice formations and weather patterns, it would have been published or archived normally. The fact that it wasn't means it contained something else. That something could rewrite our understanding of recent history, ancient civilizations, or what lies beneath the ice of the last unexplored continent. Admiral Byrd's personal journal was auctioned once in 1971. The buyer's name was never released. And until that journal surfaces again, we're left with questions that no official narrative seems willing to answer. If you want to go deeper into suppressed exploration history and the Antarctic Treaty's hidden clauses, that video is on screen now. I break down the geological evidence for ice-free Antarctica and what it means for human timeline models. And if you made it this far, subscribe. You're not a casual viewer. You're someone who actually wants to know what's being hidden. Join the others who are questioning the official story. I'll see you in the next one.